The steps for this project are proving to be more challenging than anticipated, so part 2 will feature the fuel cap only, rather than the original plan of fuel cap and steps. The fuel caps provided with the 4300 are identical to the fuel caps in the S-Series kits, which are nicely molded and well detailed and built into decent models in their own right, but the truck I'm modeling has a different style of fuel cap. It's larger in diameter, flat on top, and although this picture is a little bit on the grainy side, being a blow-up of the existing photo, here's a better picture of a similar fuel cap, flat on top, recessed area in the center, and some indentations around the edges. 3/16 brass tube has been used to make the fill neck in the fuel tank, and 732 styrene tube is a nice fit over this. Glue a small piece of 20 thou sheet styrene to the end of a length of tube, and when the glue is thoroughly cured, trim away the excess and sand the end smooth, leaving a nice sharp 90-degree corner. Drill a hole in the center, starting with a small hole. I typically use 0.32 to begin with, and work your way up in sizes to 3/32 diameter. Doing this before you cut the fuel cap from the length of tube makes it much easier to hold on to. Once the hole is drilled and cleaned up, cut off the fuel cap approximately 0.80 of an inch long and sand the bottom surface square. Now the textured surface around the edge of the cap can be created, starting with a piece of 10 thou by 20 thou styrene strip, with a small curve preformed into it by rolling it around a hobby knife handle. Cut pieces of this preformed strip 0.75 of an inch long, and with the fuel cap on a non-stick surface, here I'm using the backside of a small X-Acto square. You can also use a small piece of glass. Attach these pieces one at a time with solvent cement, using a piece of 1/64 brass strip as a spacer to ensure consistent gaps between each of the pieces. Solvent cement does cause the cap to stick to the surface, but it's easily popped free with a hobby knife once it's all glued together, and it can be cleaned up, resulting in a flat top cap with indentations around the edges as shown here. Punch a disc from 10 thou styrene of a diameter that will fit inside the cap, and glue this in place to complete the cap, creating the recessed area in the center. Here I'm using a piece of 3/16 tube to ensure that it's seated squarely. At this point the cap can be painted and permanently glued in place, but it's also easy to make them removable, and to do this simply requires making a retainer chain. Here I'm using 40 links per inch by A-line, which is a model railway supplier, and it's attached to an eye bolt formed in a piece of 10 thou diameter brass wire. A small styrene disc is drilled in the center. The eye bolt is glued in place, and the excess is filed off. Glue the styrene disc in place on the underside of the fuel cap, keeping it centered, and measure the length of the retainer chain so it will hang down slightly inside the tank past the end of the 3/16 brass tube. Cut to the appropriate length. Insert 10 thou brass wire into the end link and secure with solder. Here I'm keeping everything extra long and holding the wire in place with magnets for the soldering operation. Trim the wire to length, leaving a piece of wire 90 degrees to the chain, which will drop inside the brass tube and secure the fuel cap, just like on the real trucks. Finish consists of Model Master silver chrome trim applied with a brush and sealed with dull coat. Normally the cap wouldn't be installed at this stage, it wouldn't go on until after painting. This is just being done for demonstration purposes, showing how the retainer chain holds the cap, and the brass wire is flexible enough to allow the cap to be pulled out. This approach can be used on other types of fuel caps as well. For example, here's a Kenworth cab over, and the fuel cap on it has a T-shaped piece sticking out of the top, a little hard to see in this picture. Here's a better view of a cap of this style. And this was done in model form by gluing a piece of 20 thou square styrene strip to the end of a piece of 20 thou styrene rod, inserting it into a styrene disc of an appropriate diameter to match the fuel tank fitting on the AMT Kenworth kit. This piece is molded solid, but it's easily drilled out once glued to the tank by starting with a small diameter hole like 032 and working way up progressively in the sizes. Punch out a styrene disc of appropriate diameter to fit loosely inside this hole, attach a retainer chain, and glue to the underside of the fuel cap. One more example, this time on a Freightliner, representing a brass screw-in style cap. A 20 thou styrene disc is punched out of appropriate diameter to match the fuel cap boss on the kit tank. The basic parts are the styrene disc, 10 thou by 20 thou styrene strip for the rib on the top, and a smaller diameter disc for the inside of the cap. This is made from thicker material, typically a 30 or 40 thousandths of an inch. Glue the rib in place on top of the cap, leaving it extra long so it can be trimmed off and cleaned up later. This is an older model, and here I drilled a hole in the center of the smaller disc to attach the retainer chain. This I glued in place, and I also use a different approach to attach the retainer wire at the bottom, twisting it around through the bottom link. For future models, I'm going to stick with soldering this cross wire in place and also attaching the retainer chain with an eye bolt. Because this cap is intended to represent a brass one, it was painted with Testors brass on the top and bottom surfaces. Even a simple fuel cap can be its own little fun modeling project. Making them removable is of course completely optional, and I certainly have no intention of putting real diesel fuel in the model tanks, but it was an enjoyable challenge. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of this installment. Part 3 is a work in progress. The steps are being just a little bit more difficult than I'd expected, but we'll get them sorted out soon enough.